Maria Callas. When it comes to the great divas of the mid-20th century, who can compare with La Divina? She was, in fact, the epitome of diviness, both in her art and in her life. Even acknowledging the great popularity of opera then, she was perhaps the most identifiable public personality of the musical world. There were, of course, superstars like Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, and, of course, Mario Lanza, but they were mostly popular singers. What is extraordinary was that she was loyal to opera and never tried to popularize herself to the broad public. She was almost always surrounded by controversy. Her voice was adored by some and detested by others. It was, in fact, never considered that beautiful. It was her marvelous role as a singing actress that was so spectacular, although some thought she overacted. The power of her voice was quite extraordinary. Even more prominent than the controversies of her singing were the controversies in her life. She was constantly battling with the managers of opera houses and with the press, who portrayed her in the most negative light they could get away with. Yes, she wasn't warm and cuddly. She spoke her mind and didn't mind ruffling a few feathers. Temperamental? Of course. Leonard Bernstein called her the Bible of opera. I could continue with the practically endless stream of praise she receives. Even now, 50 years after her death, her recordings are among the best-selling albums. Callas was Greek, but she was in fact born in New York in 1923. Her parents were from Athens, and they moved to New York with their 2 children to improve their economic situation. Her mother had become pregnant, and Maria was born shortly after their arrival in New York. The Callas household was a place of constant squabbling. Maybe she had to be loud to be heard over the yelling. Her birth disappointed her mother, since she wasn't a boy, the ambitious boy that Mom wanted. Gradually, her mother, who favored her other daughter, became the archetypical stage mother when her prodigious singing talent emerged. She was 3. She was trotted out to sing whenever her mother wanted to impress anyone. Later, Maria claimed how much she hated this and how she hated being deprived of a normal, carefree childhood. Her negative feelings for her mother never diminished, but in fact really got much worse. Her public performing began at school in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, where her father had a pharmacy. She sang the Mikado and the Pirates of Penzance. Her father was a notorious philanderer, and the fighting never stopped. Well, the marriage finally fell apart, and her parents were divorced. In 1937, her mother took her back to Athens. She was only 14, but her mother made a huge effort and eventually got her admitted to the Greek National Conservatory and into the care of an excellent voice teacher. She was a very hard worker, and the excellence of her vocal technique was solidified then. After a bit, she was accepted at the more prestigious Athens Conservatory after she sang Tantuzza in Cavalleria Rusticana in a student performance at the Greek National Opera. She began auditioning for parts in operas. She was phenomenal, but a problem was her size. She was a big and very chubby teenager. When World War II broke out, things got quite bad, and Greece was occupied by the Italian fascists and then by the Nazis. A rumor has persisted that she was made by her mother to entertain the soldiers, while the mother did the same. They had no money, so this is conceivable, but is probably just a rumor. Her first star performance was in 1942 as Tosca, which has remained one of her signature roles. When the war ended, she had the good fortune to meet the great conductor Tullio Serafin, who immediately saw the limitless potential of the young woman. She had her mainstream debut because of this man. It was in 1946 at the great Roman Arena in Verona. She was La Gioconda in the opera of the same name. It was there that she met Giovanni Menangini, an older, wealthy industrialist, and they married in 1949. He became her manager, and she always appreciated how he has made her career take off, although their marriage was dissolved in 1959, but more of that later. Serafin became her mentor and supporter. Her great turning point was in Venice at La Fenice in 1949, where she was singing Brunhilde. I always find it fascinating that she was singing Brunhilde, and was asked to also sing the part of Elvira in Il Puritani. A dramatic part like Brunhilde and a coloratura bel canto part like Puritani. It seemed inconceivable that a singer could sing two such different parts in her career, let alone in the same season. It was like asking Birgit Nilsson to substitute for Beverly Sills. She had become a star. This chance event led to the part of her singing bel canto. This led to the part of her career singing bel canto, and to the revival for everyone of long-forgotten bel canto repertory. This ability to jump from dramatic to coloratura singing was a hallmark of her recital programs. But a noticeable thing that was missing was a big debut at La Scala. Now, she had sung Aida there as a last-minute replacement for Renata Tebaldi, more about her later, and the La Scala general manager took an immediate dislike to her. But now that she was a star, La Scala came calling, and she became the center of her performances during the 50s. Many productions were created especially for her with the greatest conductors and the greatest directors. In 1954, she decided that she was tired of being overweight, and over that year lost close to 100 pounds. She remained slim for the rest of her career. A controversy still exists about the effect of the weight loss on her voice. Her young voice had the remarkable range from F sharp below middle C to E natural above high C. This fact was in itself controversial at the upper end, and listening to all her recordings doesn't resolve this issue. Eventually, she did develop a wobble at the high end, which she could be attributed to a loss of her diaphragm musculature as a result of the weight loss. Her voice did become softer and became more feminine. But does this really matter? Her supremacy was as an actress, a singing actress. The essence of her art was refinement, and her power flowed not from excess, but from concentration and musicianship. Very few video was barely invented at the time, of her exist, and the longevity of her audio recordings stems from how all of the dramatic talent she had could be heard through the voice without a picture. She would often talk about her singing. When one wants to find a gesture, when you want to find how to act on stage, all you have to do is listen to the music. The composer has already seen to all of that. A less-known fact about her is how nearsighted she was. She couldn't see what was going on around her on the stage, but her extraordinary memory paid off. Her memory enabled her to learn a role in many of the operas in less than a week, including the staging, so that she could step into a new role immediately. In fact, she performed in almost 50 different operas. Here are some of the greatest ones, with some things about each of them. Norma was her most performed opera, 89 times. It's the classic story of a woman who is in love with her people's enemy and has to choose between love and duty. Tosca, the perfect role for her. The audio recording at Covent Garden may be the greatest opera recording ever. Unfortunately, Act 2 was the only one recorded on camera, and you can see what I mean about her. This is Tosca at her finest. Scarpia is played by Tito Gobbi, who is as great as ever. When she finally passes away in Act 4 of Traviata, her voice perfectly reflects her diminishing life. A nasty joke went around that Violetta was a perfect role for her, a hooker with a heart of gold. Not true. She wasn't a hooker, and she did not have a heart of gold. Her performance of Lisbon of Traviata in 1958 became the subject of a famous play about her gay fans. Callas was a great favorite of gay men, just like Judy Garland and Marlene Dietrich were. Lucia di Lammermoor, after Norma, this was her best bel canto opera. Her portrayal of Medea was so remarkable that when she was no longer singing, she starred in a movie version directed by the great Pier Paolo Pasolini. La Sonnambula was one of her bel canto favorites and is filled with fabulous coloratura singing. The Bar of Seville was one of her earlier triumphs, and she was one of the greatest Rosinas. This was more or less her only comedy. Parsifal is an opera she sang early in her career when she was still only a dramatic soprano. In Pagliacci and Cavalleria Rusticana, she gave her two most famous Verismo performances. Rigoletto. Gilda is quite a different character than these other powerful women that she typically portrays, but her Gilda was a game changer for the role. Andrea Chenier is a lesser-known opera, but with her as Andrea, it was a revelation, and the opera had a revival. What operas didn't she sing? Well, she never sang Mimi in La Bohème. It's hard to imagine her in that role. But she did do a Madame Butterfly, which is actually also hard to imagine. It would be pretty hard to avoid the role which scandal played in Callas's career. For example, as I mentioned earlier, she did have a very low opinion of her mother, and anything she said about her mother would become news. They would report anything nasty that she happened to do. A love life, for example, it was always of interest to the press. When she left her husband Meneghini, For Onassis, the shipping magnate, it was front page news. And her life with Ari in the world of yachts and mansions and wealthy friends, they filled many newspaper pages. There was a picture in 1955 of her snarling furiously at a process server for a lawsuit by someone who claimed he was her agent. That led to her getting the nickname Tigress and portraying her as a temperamental prima donna, which actually wasn't too far off. Then there was her rivalry with Renata Tebaldi as to who was the primus prima donna. That became a cause célèbre, although it was mostly imaginary. It was suspected to be a made-up story for the publicity of it. In fact, in high school, my friends and I were of two camps, the Tebaldi camp and the Callas camp. I was a Tebaldiite, but have since changed my mind. Time magazine, cover story, just before her Met debut, talking about her conflicts with her mother, and led to some nasty reactions by Maria. It had nothing to do with her singing at the Met. When she didn't perform an extra non-contracted performance being presented at the Edinburgh Music Festival by La Scala, they let her take all the heat for it, never explaining what was really going on, and she was so furious, she stopped singing at La Scala for quite a while. One time, this time in Rome, she was ill. Doctors even testified that she had bronchitis, but she was forced to sing a performance because the president of Italy was in the audience. She walked out after Act 1. But she bore all the guilt or whatever it was for not performing. When Rudolph Bing, the new Met manager at the time, and Maria had trouble agreeing on a contract, he terminated her. He terminated her contract. Headlines. They eventually reconciled, and she sang that most wonderful Tosca. In 1960, she was basically burned out. The pressure of always performing at the topmost level had gotten to her, and she began to lose self-confidence. She knew that the critics were waiting with the poison pen that they held to pounce on any fault she made. Her voice indeed had gone not so good. It lost its solidity. They blamed it on her weight loss, but it's not clear whether that's true. And she did develop, you can hear it in the recordings, a wobble in her high notes. It can't be ignored. She tried making movies. She made a non-musical film, Medea, directed by the great Pier Paolo Pasolini, but it was more of a curiosity than anything else. A great success, very great success, were her master classes at Juilliard, and luckily they made videos of them, which are really wonderful to watch. It led to a play being written. Terence McNally wrote the play Masterclass in 1995, and it's still being revived. She continued to be in demand for recitals, but eventually her voice was really gone, and people attended more or less out of just nostalgia and being able to say that they saw Callas sing. Her final public recital performance in 1974 with tenor Giuseppe De Stefano was really a disaster. They were two worn-out singers, and that was it. In 1966, she decided to renounce her U.S. citizenship because she wanted to marry Ari Onassis, and she couldn't because, according to the U.S., she was married to Meneghini and could not get a divorce. This made her a Greek citizen when she renounced her U.S. citizenship, and that meant that they weren't really married because in Greece, if you're married in a Roman Catholic church, it doesn't count. So she was never married to Meneghini in Greece, and therefore she could marry Onassis in Greece. But that was not to happen. In 1968, he married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of slain JFK. She lived her final years alone in Paris in a suite at the Ritz until her death in 1977 at the age of 53. Her ashes were kept at Père Lachaise. They were stolen once, and when they recovered them, they were distributed over the Aegean Sea, just like she wanted. There are many, many books, many documentary films about her. Many. Here we are, now almost 50 years after her death, and there's a new biopic in production with none other than Angelina Jolie as La Divina. With a story like hers, what would make sense to me would be an opera. Bellini, Donizetti, Rossini, Verdi, and Puccini would be brought back, and they would collaborate and write the score. I suppose you might, half in jest, say that Maria Callas's great aria from Norma is a semi-ironic metaphor. Indeed, Casta Diva means chaste goddess, and she was, indeed, a goddess.